to Tropic topics. This is the third in our series, and I'm really happy to see new faces as well as familiar faces. And I'm Prudence Gill, and I have the ongoing pleasure of having put together this series. And I want to mention that next week we have Bill Durham with meditation, It's Not What You Think. And then the following week we have Kathy, who's going to be doing outside oneself volunteering as a new beginning, and they both will be, I think, wonderful. And thank you to Clint Bush for his the first Tropic topic that he did. Let it off. He's here tonight. So my thanks to the Key Biscayne Community Center and the Senior A.S.K Club for sponsoring this series. And you guys know, just it's informal, so we're gathered. You may ask questions. You have copies of Franklin's bibliography for what he's going to present. And you're free to take that home with you because it's a lot to read while we sit here. And there's copies of the Constitution as well, and feel free to take those. And I am going to skip right over to Franklin now because he really doesn't need an introduction with all of you. So we can begin with political philosophy, democracy, and civic engagement. So thank you all very much for being here.
It's awfully good of you to allow lifelong learning to intrude on your Wednesday evenings. For those of you that were at the Living Healthy event last week, some of you were, one of the prescriptions for a good and long life is what we're going to do tonight. Try to learn. So thanks for doing this. After tonight's extensive content on the subject of democracy, I will see you next week because we're all going to need meditation. We got a lot to cover, so I'm going to try to roll through notes that I prepared so that this can be well organized. But interrupt me. It's free country. Anything you want to talk about? It's probably better to just stop me in my tracks, and I will reserve the right to exercise autocratic despotism if I feel like we need to just get through this. And so we'll reserve for later if I feel like we just need to, with your indulgence. To get going, I guess I wish that I felt a little better. My voice might be wobbly, but in the spirit of American excellence, we're just going to press it. Okay. Last week on NPR, there was a radio program that reported on the fact that what they call dystopian literature has spiked in popular acclaim. And the example that they gave on the radio was that the novel 1984 was the top seller on Amazon's order list and had exceeded the average annual sales over a long time by 9,000%. The radio program didn't connect this to national politics or the 2016 election, but I thought it might have something to do with that. Tonight's talk won't have anything to do with that at all. Except it's unmistakable as we sit here tonight that a lot of people are concerned about the future of our country. And so what better time than to take a look at the past, the founding of our country. So that's what I thought to try to prepare to do in an organized way, touching on things that I came to think were important. Not necessarily the spark notes of civics, but things that I drew from reading and thinking about this subject. So I will start right at the very end. The Constitution of the United States, the first three words are "We the people," in big, large, bold letters. I think we all probably know that because we're sufficiently familiar with the Constitution to know "We the people." But in preparing to talk with you tonight about this subject, I learned something that I really had sort of glimpsed maybe, but didn't really grasp about what that means. In our constitutional democracy, we have rights. But what I've learned is our constitutional democracy positively depends on our asserting those rights. That's essential if we're going to enjoy the promise of freedom. I don't think I made that connection nationally, although I have made that connection locally. And I've talked locally for years about the importance of showing up at things like this and participating in our public life, because things just go better. If we are informed about what we're working on and what our policy choices are, and we participate, we just do better. But it's a big country. And I think in my life's experience, I never drew the connection between we the people having to be, by necessity, an active and engaged citizenry nationally, which includes the state, which includes regionally, and the full functionality of democracy. I have talked a lot about this, and I often wonder at the Citizen Engagement Academy, which I try to put sweat equity into as best I can, whether this message is just platitude and whether people think it's just a pep talk. I don't think it is, and if they think it is, we got to change our dialogue, because I think this is very important. But it's not a pep talk. It's essential. And our founding fathers knew it, and they depended on us getting the message and acting on it. And I'll try to prove that to you tonight, philosophically and logically and historically. So to get there, we're going to go through how our government was formed to be moderate, despite elements of human nature that are difficult to control, that cause us to go wayward in our decision making and cause our organization at really any level to be messy, potentially. And we'll try to understand what freedom really means and why freedom has a role in what I just was talking about action. I'd love to do this Socratically, but we only have an hour, maybe a little less than an hour. We don't have a semester, and I am not an academic. I just read this stuff, and some of it you've read, some of it you haven't. If you are a constitutional scholar, please go easy on me, but I will try to keep up. If you disagree with anything I say, let me know. It's a free country. And if you want to talk about it at any level, as I said, just kick in. And please keep your eye on the clock and kick me so that I don't ad lib.
Okay, let's keep
I've
going.
organized this so that we can have natural pauses in case there's something that you want to reflect on. And so the first jumping off point I call the challenge of freedom. An English philosopher whose name, and also a mathematician, his name was Alfred North Whitehead, said that the whole of European philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And Plato said the punishment for those who don't participate in public life is to be governed by lesser men. My whole message tonight is a footnote to Plato. And Aristotle, Plato's disciple, backed this up. He said broad civic engagement is essential because the many are less corruptible than the few. So Plato and Aristotle tell us that when it comes to public participation, the more the better. In our personal lives and in society, in our families, with our friends, when we have to make decisions, whether we act in a leadership role and try to be influential or not, someone will. And that someone may or may not be wise, kind, benevolent, may not have comprehension of what's at issue. Maybe they will. So if we don't show up actively in decision making, we get what we get. Some people are reliably wise and benevolent and well-informed, and others are reliably the opposite. And we all know that. So the good news is we're free to engage. but we're also free not to. And if we sit on the sidelines, or if we self-limit our engagement because we think we're powerless, we get what we get. That's not inconsistent with freedom. But if we want to enjoy freedom in the positive sense that we mean when we say freedom, in the sense of liberty and justice for all, we don't get that guaranteed unless we work for it. This may seem self-evident as I say it. It wasn't quite so self-evident as I started to think about it, because freedom at the very bottom is just opportunity. Freedom is the absence of coercion. So we have the opportunity to decide what we think and what we want to do. But opportunity and actualization are not the same thing. Guaranteed rights don't guarantee right decisions, right outcomes. We have the right to speak and think freely. But what happens if we're co-opted by propaganda? Or if we can't see past our prejudices? We can assemble in groups and we can petition the government. But if we don't bother, or if we do so in a merely discontented rabble without contributing anything, then not much good comes from having the right to assemble and petition. So we have the right to decide things, but there's no guarantee in the state of freedom that the decisions will be good ones.
Or the state of Florida.
Or in the state of Florida. So free people are not free from their own blind spots, and we're not free from those baser aspects of our human nature that lead us astray. Freedom, in this sense, is outcome neutral. We're free to be wise or foolish, and we are quite capable of being either. It has been said about the United States that we are not likely to be conquered from outside, but we are always exposed to ruin from within. And I don't know if you've heard that, but I've heard it a lot. That's because people who think that think the biggest threat in a democracy is that we will blow it. We won't be up to the challenge of freedom. So if you grasp this and grasp the proposition that our outcomes are up to us, then you have to conclude that's a big responsibility if we want good outcomes, which we do. So when we think of freedom as a gift, I'm suggesting to you that we better start thinking of it, if we haven't already done so, more as a responsibility. Which brings me to the subject of virtue, at which I will pause to see how we're doing. Okay. When I say the Founding Fathers, I'm referring to this generation, the revolutionary generation. There were really two generations. The Dickinsons and the Washingtons and the Adamses were one generation. Jefferson was sort of a half generation, and Madison and Hamilton were a whole other generation. And Franklin was a half generation above the elders. That's who I speak of when I talk about the Founding Fathers or the Founders. And there were mothers too. You can't mistake the presence of Abigail Adams in my bibliography, who's very important in all of this. The Founders knew that mankind is selfish and has divergent interests, and that our own propensity to self-protect and to arrogate to ourselves what we think is ours, and our ideologies make factions and prevent us from doing what Jane Torres tried to help us do last week, which is talk across differences. And all of that makes moderation and consensus very difficult. And if you add to those challenges the true fact that people are flawed and corruptible, it's a bouillabaisse of challenge to figure out how to self-govern. But people may be flawed and corruptible, but there's also good in the world. People are virtuous. As much venality as exists, there exists maybe more virtue. Whoever's in power is transitory, and they may be good or bad. They may bring out our better angels, or they may bring out the opposite. So is it safe to say that we can rely on our institutions and traditions because they're not transitory? I think it's not safe to do that, in part because the institutions that we rely on necessarily are at some level only as good as the people that are in transitory power running them. Mm-hmm. And they come and go, and you know, the expression turning a battleship, if we put ourselves in a bad direction, first of all, it takes a pretty long time to realize it. And it takes a really long time to correct it. Meanwhile, things are going wrong, harm is being done. We're not living up to our promise. So we the people, the first three words in the Constitution, are the backstop, ultimately, against this. And my message tonight is we have to cultivate our best capabilities so that we can be up to the job. And that's why education is so important. And that's why we fight and champion and pay for education, whether or not we have children in school. And that's why an excellent press is so important, so that we know what's going on. We have a free press, but there's no guarantee that that free press is not going to self-censor or is going to be excellent. So we have to be smart about what we read and not just get our information from our self-selected bubble where we're only validating what we already think. Our founders and their philosophical mentors, about which we're going to speak, thought that the success of democracy depended on broad participation among an educated and interested citizenry. And they assumed, hopefully but not assuredly, that there'd be enough virtue among the general population to make democracy work. Madison said, from the Federalist, if you take in a greater variety of interests, you make it less probable that the majority will have a common interest to invade the rights of others, or that it will be more difficult for the majority to realize that they have a common interest, or to act in unison upon it. What this means is that virtue increases as the denominator gets bigger. The more public participation, the better the polity. And to pick up on a theme of Tropic topics, which is wonderful, and thank you for doing this. If we engage in this community with heart and soul and brain, we get a stronger and better Key Biscayne. We're better neighbors off the island. We enrich ourselves and our institutions by doing things like this. And we teach a critical lesson to our children. And as Clint reminded us 2 weeks ago, we'll be happier and more fulfilled in our lives. So it's good to do this. I hope to prove this to you, as I said, philosophically and historically. I'm going to start with the Declaration of Independence. It's very familiar to all of us. We'll work through the Constitution and especially the ratification process, which is not widely talked about. And we will whiz by classical philosophy and the Age of the Enlightenment to get to the end. Ready to set the stage?
Let's go.
So it's 1763. It's 1763, and Britain and France had been involved in a war, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. That war is ended. The British America is secure from French ambitions in North America. But Britain is depleted fiscally and militarily. Britain imposes on the colonies a stamp tax and other revenue-raising measures that were wildly unpopular, and according to some people's opinions, were disproportionately burdensome because we weren't there, we were here. They could adopt a levy, we weren't there to complain about it. They did not go over well. Repeal and replace became a theme in 1768, 69, 70. Repeal and replace resulted in, among other things, a monopoly on tea, favoring the East India China Company, which was insolvent, a monopoly on tea to distribute tea to North America, with a tea tax, which, as you know, famously brewed over in the Boston Tea Party. Parliament went wild. A lot of money was lost, by the way. And think in terms of conservative people doing radical acts, by the way. Property damage was not common. So these were provoked people. And Parliament was provoked and harsh and oppressive, and the king was angry, at the very least, acquiescent to a harsh and oppressive Parliament, but vindictive in his own. And crisis upon crisis fell on these colonies. And out of this, the United States of America was born. Independence was not the goal. Reconciliation was the goal for a long time. But after trying and failing at reconciliation, our conservative forefathers adopted rebellion. Thanks to France, which was our first national ally, we became independent. And we became able to construct a government that was absolutely unique, without precedent. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, as Abraham Lincoln put it. Which brings us to the Declaration of Independence. The Founding Fathers were conservative men of property and status. Moderates, mostly. Nobody was radical. Massachusetts was the only province which was a tinderbox. Peace prevailed despite the provocations and antipathy towards taxes elsewhere in a big country. But diverse and geographically distant colonies, which had little in common, rallied to revolution, despite differences, despite risks, and despite a natural deference among conservative traditional people to king and parliament. They had everything to lose. They were viewed as seditious traitors, and they put it all on the line. What were they thinking? Well, we don't have to intuit what they were thinking because they told us in reams of paper. The Declaration of Independence makes the case, like a legal brief, that the United States of America, and United is a small U at the time, had the right and the duty to throw off the sovereign authority of Great Britain and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. And this was justified because the British sovereign, the king, through a long series of abuses, evinced a design to reduce these colonies to absolute despotism. But don't take their word on it, they said. A decent respect to the opinion of mankind required justification. So the justification is familiar to us all, and it's magnificent, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government, and to institute a new government in such form as they think will best ensure their safety and happiness. The Declaration of Independence goes on to list 26 specific usurpations and injuries at the hands of the king, who is declared a tyrant. And then, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions and the protection of divine providence, 56 representatives of 2.5 million colonialists signed their names declaring that we are free and independent. What a remarkable presumption for these rustics in the boondocks to repudiate a sovereign king and take to themselves superseding rights. You know, Parliament didn't say, you know, they have a point. Edmund Burke did. But this was utterly radical. And hayseeds from the provinces, very far away from cosmopolitan Europe and all of the Enlightenment thinking, presumed to recreate an entire society. I think it's stunning. But I think it's useful to try to understand it, because to understand it helps us understand what came next, and what came next is really the point of our discussion tonight. The founding generation were well read, back to education. They were well read, especially in the law. In the colonies, Blackstone's Commentaries was one of the most popular imports. People read the law. It's been suggested that the founders may have had a sense of opportunity to self-create their own destiny because they lived through, or they knew about, major upheavals in a progressive age. The Protestant Reformation, Cromwell, the restoration of the crown, the Jacobite rebellion, the big split between Catholicism and the Anglican Church that never ended. They knew all of these things. They were big upheavals, all radical events. But men of those ages took a role in transforming the ages in which they lived, and these men knew that. It's also been suggested that perhaps they had, despite the fact that they were propertied men of stature, less an instinctual respect for tradition because they lived so far away. And by and large, they spent their lives in the colonies. There were exceptions. John Dickinson was educated in England. Ben Franklin was in England and France for years. But by and large, they were provincials. They weren't utopianists, but they were affected by the intellectual and moral dynamism of the Age of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment mantra was reason. Use your reason. Thinking critically, skeptically. Is sedition reasonable? I think it's a tough question, but they cared a lot about natural law and natural rights, which was a big point of the Enlightenment. And also, the exaltation of reason in the Enlightenment is exactly the opposite of mental subjugation by a king, of authority telling you what to think. And they were influenced by that. And there were some other things that they were influenced by. So now I'm going to turn to a quick philosophy lesson. How we doing?
Yes.
You ready for philosophy? We'll start with Socrates. Socrates wanted us to understand high concepts like morality and justice and equality, but not the everyday meaning of the words. More what these conditions are in their true nature. And how can we know these things? By endless, deep, relentless questioning, by discussion, the Socratic method. We come to recognize through the Socratic method that certain conditions are good and sacred by their nature, not because a majority thinks so, but because of their true nature. Things are good, quote, things are good not because the gods love them. The gods love them because they are good. There's a hint of natural rights in that. Plato makes us think about what is a good life and how do we achieve it. For Plato, people who want to be good have to learn what is good. Truth and wisdom are the guides, and pursuing both with energy enables us to understand what is good and to choose goodness. And if we choose goodness, we will act justly. And if we act with justice, we will disseminate justice. And broad justice imparts social order. And good order is the necessary condition for stability and progress and happiness. So in politics, for Plato, those who are good don't seek power, but they make the best leaders. On the other hand, those who don't know good lust for power and fame, and they divide the state and cause upheaval. So think of the philosopher king. I think part of what I drew from preparing this is that although Thomas Jefferson would not have agreed that common men could be philosophers or kings, that there's got to be a little bit of the philosopher king in all of us if we're going to participate in the society the way I suggest we can and should. Aristotle's much the same. With intellectual and ethical rigor, we should perfect our nature. Happiness follows discipline and restraint. We're social animals, drawn to the public life, drawn to each other. And virtue grows with engagement in public and with each other. And virtue is the basis for a good life. Good and virtuous men and women create good government and good societies. And wide participation in government and society is essential because, he said, the many are more incorruptible than the few. But while Aristotle challenges restraint and discipline, which you may think of as conservative principles, he also anticipates an Enlightenment liberalism. Because Aristotle comes to recognize that a good and ethical life requires means. If you're living in subsistence, you don't have the time to be contemplative. So poverty is not conducive to virtue. So this drives, with Aristotle, an impulse to create opportunities and to look out for those who are weaker. Quickly, Thomas Hobbes, life is nasty, short, and brutish, so we yield to authority to keep order. The Leviathan is the commonwealth of all of us with an autocratic leader who's strong and keeps order. But there's a limit, because the inalienable right to life cannot be violated. That's the first law of nature. So Hobbes gets to our collective right to oppose despotic authority. Rousseau tells us we're born free, but we live in chains. The citizenry is a collective, and order comes from our collectively more or less agreeing to get along, the social contract. He talks about inequality, and that's part of this. If you get back to what Aristotle said about poverty, Rousseau picks up on the notion that if we're really going to get along, some of us can't have everything and some of us have nothing. Which brings me to John Locke. And I spent a little bit of time on this, and I'm going to read through this because I think this really was influential to the Founding Fathers. We are all born equal, without innate philosophy or knowledge of God or good and evil, or the nature of things. But God endowed us with reason, so we can learn. There's freedom in nature, the freedom to work it out for ourselves. And an aspect of that is tolerance. Since there's no preordained universal truth, it follows that we all come to different considerations through reason, and we have to tolerate that. We have to tolerate different points of view. So natural freedom is our birthright, a veritable gift from God, but there is no perfect freedom if my freedom infringes on yours. Since we all have natural freedoms that we all sort of self-describe, conflicts arise inevitably. And so freedom requires a structure to protect each other's rights from each other. And this gets to law courts and legislation to moderate conflicts. So Locke forces us to confront the need for tolerance on the one hand, but order on the other hand. They need to be balanced. There's an inherent tension between what's mine and what's yours. My right to swing my arm ends at your nose. You've heard that? So we need, the challenge is we need to find a way to define the parameters so that I don't hit you in the nose. Where competing rights are in balance and respected and regulated fairly and proportionally. Pluralism in our country makes this very difficult, but the principle is the same. Freedom carries the obligation and limit, paradoxically, to self-restrain our own freedom. Think of that. But not too long, because we've got a lot to go. The Constitution is built around human nature. Humans are likely to be all over the place, so the Constitution balances all the oscillations, power and restraint, realism and idealism. It provides for liberties and it checks abuses. It encourages progress among those who are sort of reluctant, but it also chills experimentation for those who go too far. How did we go from this blank slate of anything is possible to what William Gladstone called the most wonderful work ever struck by the mind and imagination of man? Back to history. The revolution is concluded. The states are aligned in Articles of Confederation. Things aren't working very well, but there's no real provocation to change anything. Until 1786, a group of farmers in western Massachusetts who were former soldiers in the Revolution and upset about money speculation and debt revolted. And all of a sudden, the natural rights of man seemed less important than law and order. So now, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists have to debate, how do we organize this society? Montesquieu, checks and balances, separation of power. The organizational structure is critical so that no branch, no person, no faction can tip the balance. But that's not enough because we still have to depend on virtue. We're really kind of getting close to an hour, so
Are you all okay to stay a little bit longer? Yeah? Okay. We'll keep wrapping it up.
All right, I'll keep wrapping it up. So there's general agreement on checks and balances, but we fear tyranny and chaos identically, equally. So you have to navigate between a strong national government and the populist agrarian tendencies that distrust that very thing the same way they distrusted Great Britain. We just got done throwing over a tyrant, and the first thing we have to do is now adopt what those people thought would be a tyranny. A domestic tyrant is no more tolerable than a foreign tyrant. So what kind of government would make this all work? For Benjamin Franklin, it was democracy if we can keep it. Franklin said, democracy is like two wolves and a lamb debating what to eat for lunch. and liberty is the lamb armed to the teeth contesting the vote. A powerful government, central government, would be coercive, inevitably. But what about private liberties? So this is the wrestling match, with Locke and Plato and Aristotle and Montesquieu, and it shows up in the constitutional debates and in the Federalist Papers, which Prudence was good enough to cite, and which you can read if you're interested. The animus behind all of this was fear. Fear of uncontrolled power, fear of despotism, fear that little d democracy, the Jeffersonian, agrarian, we're all philosopher kings as long as we're aristocrats, would run amok. Fear that human nature and human weakness would cause us to blow it. Washington urged audacity, and I cited this because we don't hear Washington's authentic voice too much. Mostly it's speeches and formal letters. In an impromptu, I think, Washington says it's probable that no plan we propose will be adopted. But if we please the people by offering what we ourselves disapprove, what have we done? So aim high. The arguments were endless, and I don't think we have time or patience, perhaps, although if you do, we can. But I cited a bunch of the point counterpoint. They're really challenging because everybody's right. Everybody's equally correct. But somebody has to make a decision.
Read a couple of them.
Yeah.
The debate, okay, so one of the debates was, you've heard of the supremacy clause in the Constitution, which says that the federal government is supreme, although the states reserve whatever power is not expressly delegated to the federal. Well, the states and the agrarian interests said, wait a minute, that's a sham, because state sovereignty will be meaningless. Because the vested aristocracy that will become the federal government will take and take and take. Well, the counter-arguments were limited delegation of powers, the states retain the right to elect, to adopt the election laws, the states run the elections, and the states have all the residual powers constitutionally, which cannot change constitutionally. And people are more attached locally. They're more likely to participate and be influential locally. So there will be a mere echo of that local participation nationally. It will be diluted. That doesn't anticipate 24-hour cable news, but that was a true sensibility at the time. Another example is the federal taxing power. The notion was that we'll be too hungry, we'll be too greedy, we'll be too selfish. Now, it's hard to say that that's not a serious consideration. But the answer to that was somewhat legalistic, but true, that the federal taxing power only exists for three purposes, and they're limited and specific. And beyond that, the federal government has no power to tax. That is true. An argument, the national army would become manipulated by zealots, and the state militias could all be nationalized. I know you're thinking of the Second Amendment here. But Congress controls the funding, and to have that kind of bad faith at the national government, where Congress is elected every 2 years, would require the president, who's also elected every 4 years, and the infrastructure in Washington to basically co-opt incoming congressmen on the fly every 2 years. And Madison asks, could there be such an instant and persistent cabal? It's a fair question, but it's also a fair criticism. Washington, D.C. was a negotiated solution for the national bank, basically, the Federal Reserve. People worried that Washington would be, you're not going to believe this, but an uninhibited swamp of self-interest. And part because there's no natural constituency. There's no it was built out of a swamp, literally. But that was a serious concern. So you get an idea. The people that were thinking about these problems really distrusted human nature. People have different and unequal faculties and abilities and interests, and we cannot have a system that teeter-totters between one extreme and another. So a skeptical nation had to become convinced that we just needed a strong national government, but with checks and balances. Madison and Hamilton make these really brilliant arguments, and if you read them, they read well today. The institutional complexity of the national government would itself stabilize competing interests. People would select people like them to be their representatives. Members of the learned professions, particularly lawyers, would help because they would be independent and learned. The goal of representative government was not to mirror individual interests, but to meld contesting forces. And the way to do that was in this structure. But at the end, the structure wasn't the answer, it was human nature. Human nature loomed largest. The people who could not put the glass half empty down, the answer ultimately was, we have larger problems if this fails. If constitutional government fails as an experiment, it's because we will have failed it, unless human nature saves the day. The Constitution of the United States is that complex system poised in equilibrium. It's that web of compromises and checks and balances, different branches, different interests, each weighing against the other. Pressures at one point activate counterbalancing pressures at another point. Ambition counteracts ambition. Power blunts power. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lists the specific powers of the national government, and Article 1, Section 9 restricts those very powers. The President proposes, Congress disposes. The President nominates judges, Senate has to confirm. President recommends treaties, Senate has to confirm. President is commander-in-chief, Congress appropriates the money. That's the genius. And I'm back to my theme now, and I'm going to finish. It's not enough. That brilliant structure isn't enough. The great salesman of the Constitution was James Madison. And he said at the end that everything that we hope to accomplish depended on one thing: the character of the people. It's our virtue. There is no document that does not depend on common sense, shared responsibility, the capacity to rise above pettiness and to do the right thing. So we have the potential to do well or to do not so well. And if we're good and vigilant and virtuous, we have reason to expect that we'll do well. I had a good finish, but that's a good place to end. What do you think? Greg?
It seems to me this process of gerrymandering is really corrupting this. It's causing the people to, use a wily ploy to divide up the population so that they always come out as the winner.
Yeah.
I don't know what the courts, I guess, have tried to go against that, but even here in Florida, I don't think they've been that successful.
I thoroughly agree. I've thought about, I think the two greatest risks that without really deeply thinking about this, I think gerrymandering is one of them. And I think an idealized, politicized judiciary is the other, federal judiciary is the other. You know, if you think about the effect of gerrymandering, it's that we don't choose our representatives, they choose who represents them. That's perverse.
Yeah.
And that's really what's happening, and that's why things are so polarized and entrenched. I think the courts really struggle with this because they don't want to get in the business of electioneering. But there have been cases decided in the last couple of years. They're the terribly egregious cases. North Carolina was one of them, and I think Texas was another, where the statistical evidence so clearly showed racial gerrymandering in low population districts and, you know, strong one-party population where, you know, the safe seat wanted to be held. I think that there were cases where those were overturned but sent back to the legislature. So they can sort of, you know, window dress it up and get away with something a little less egregious but still not
Well, what's happened in
adequate.
Florida? We had some kind of decision.
There's something going on.
Is that still underway as far as you know?
Last time I paid attention, it was a decision to throw out and remove from the legislature the redistricting. It went to a committee, I believe, and they came up with a solution that passed muster with the Florida Supreme Court. I think that's what happened. I may be wrong about that. But you'll hear a lot of commentators in Florida disappointed without outcome.
But in the last election, there were, let's say, 360 different representatives that were up for election throughout the country. And only 24 of them were contested districts.
Yeah.
They were either safely Democratic or safely Republican. And this is a topic that you know, a lot of people are talking about in terms of the effect of, you know, if it's safely Democratic, it's gonna go further and further left. If it's safely Republican, it's gonna go further and further right. So that the compromise is no longer necessary because they're not contested districts to start with.
We really saw that. I didn't pay terrible close attention to 2016 results, but the cities are basically blue and getting bluer, and the suburban ring around most big cities are blue, and you know, the rural areas are red. But the population skew is, as you just said, it results in this kind of polarization. Sir.
So to me, it's amazing that that in America, democracy has worked. And so, say what you will about our current situation, I have immense faith in our country that no particular election or political party can ruin our country in a short period of time. Having said that, you look at, I mean, Venezuela comes to mind. This was a democratic election, and in 1998 or whenever it was that Chavez showed up, and they're falling off the edge.
Right.
So they're going back to what you said, the quote from Madison about it all depends on human nature, it depends on our virtue. Are we somehow more virtuous than all these other countries? I mean, I think about Central Africa, I think about many countries where they have democratically elected governments, and at the same time, somehow virtue doesn't succeed. The president changes the election rules and he's still in power 36 years later. You know what I'm talking about.
I do.
So why is it that is our Constitution somehow stronger? Is our virtue somehow better? To me, it's a mystery.
I think it's a terribly important question. And there was something that I wanted to talk about that was the French Revolution. To pick up on what you just said, why does this work for us? 2 years after the Constitution was adopted, the French Revolution ensued. And the French Revolution was a bloodbath. It was horrible. And it lasted in a degraded manner for a long time. Now the French are Western educated, liberal. You know, they have the religious tradition, the civic traditions are a little different, but they have traditions, and they ran amok.
Very much.
So I think there's a lot of, the founding fathers, by the way, who obviously were aware of what was happening in France, had reason to worry that maybe this reliance on virtue had been misplaced. When the crowd becomes too passionate, it's hard to bring sense back. But it didn't happen here. Although,
And the French eventually pulled it back together, but it took a while.
I think, you know,
Had to go through dictatorship.
yeah, I mean, you know, they wound up with several iterations Napoleon Grand and Napoleon Le Petit, right? I mean, it took a long
Yeah,
time.
it took them 30 or 40 years, but eventually they got back. But I think,
Yes.
I mean, it is a mystery.
Well, this is just speculation, and it's me, so I'll try it. I think the civic tradition, possibly in the English-speaking world, is different than the civic tradition in France. And I think that may also be true if you want to take it to other Western democracies, none of which have had, that I can think of offhand, have had the duration of democracy of either Britain or France. Italy, for example. Spain is another example. And so, although they would call themselves Western democracies, I think that it's arguable that our tradition, and I'm thinking in terms of Great Britain, really when I say this, is just more ancient, more settled, more accepted at a DNA level among the population than is the case in France.
Yeah, the little reading I've done, the history of the Middle Ages, coming out of the Middle Ages, France, what was be called government was really centered around the courts and mainly about settling disputes, and you know that they have a very strong recording tradition, right? The notaries,
Yes.
you know, record everything. But like you said, the civic traditions may have not been as strong in France than say were in England.
I don't know, and I don't have an opinion on this, but I read something too that put some degree of blame on the Catholic Church and the prevailing importance of the Catholic Church in France. And I don't know that this is quite exactly what the point is, but that there's a repressive nature, a hierarchical nature, and when the lid blows off of that, and you're used to that, you know, it's like spring break.
Yeah, what the French had was the divine right?
Right.
The divine right of the king, which was really never part of the British tradition.
I think that's right.
And the church was part of that divine right.
And it may be that the whole problem with the Charles I and the beheading of the king and the Cromwellian protectorate created really it's a constitutional monarchy that persists today in England, Great Britain, but the king accepted that. You know, so if it starts at the top and
With the Magna Carta.
it's
That's what I was thinking, the Magna Carta. The British subjects had rights. And I think that's what stimulated the colonists to say, look, you know, we don't have the rights that we would have had in Britain, and they were accustomed to thinking of them that way.
I think that the Magna Carta conferred rights on barons, not people, but that's a start.
13th century.
But when you, there's a little bit of hypocrisy in this taxation without representation thing, and I'll tell you the reason I think to put it that way. In England, the social compact was strong, and people were taxed, and enclosure laws were adopted, and all kinds of things that impinged on private property, and all the things that we suffer. And the colonists made the argument that you can't do that to us because we're not represented in Parliament. Well, the truth of the matter is neither were the Midlanders in England.
Yeah.
It's not so direct as that. So there's a little bit of sophistry in this. Yes, ma'am.
I think England rebelled against the church and became Anglican. So there was not this long tradition of adhering to the hierarchy of the church. That might have had something to do with the fact that England had a different outlook on their government.
It may well, and there's lots of cause and effect, but one thing that happens in a state of upheaval is that people become accustomed to finding their equilibrium. And I'm sure that that happened I mean, it was pretty hard to be a Catholic in England at some points, but, yes, sir.
What's these big movements like the Industrial Revolution and Germany able to mechanize everything and people changing with turning robots are coming on stream and, you know, mentally I think people are getting nervous that not that there are going to be robots that are taking the world over, but when this stuff happens, things change. You don't have the guy making steel in the farm or working the pot pits, and it's a whole world different.
Yeah, I know that, and I think that's a big theme in this election, you know, the nostalgia of a bygone age being better than tomorrow.
The security.
Right. Yes, sir.
When I was reading Hamilton, there was a tension between, I think Hamilton and others. Are we a democratic state or are we a republic? And the idea of total democracy was referred to as mob rule, I think by Hamilton,
Yes.
as opposed to representative government. Would you speak to that?
That's exactly right. The Greek notion of democracy is everybody shows up at the Palladium and you have a discussion and then you take a vote. The Hamilton response to democracy is that I tried to touch on that. People are too passionate. Too many people are too ill-informed. It's neither feasible nor desirable to have a democracy because it is chaotic, especially in a big country. There are towns in Vermont that really have democracies, little towns here and
Town
there.
meetings.
They have town meetings.
Town meeting municipality.
They take a vote. There was a town in Maine that was a Democratic town that had a meeting a couple years ago. And at the meeting, they decided not to have a town anymore. They just disbanded.
What a great idea.
Don't tread on me. But I think that's exactly right. And you know, if you want to role play, and so let's all be the founding fathers, and we're trying to figure out, having this blank slate, what kind of government are we going to form? Would any of us think that it could work to have 2.5 million people simply show up and vote on every subject that comes before the national administration? That just doesn't work.
Representative democracy is what we've got, and nobody's figured out anything better that I know of. I mean, it's just not fair to compare the little town in Vermont.
It's
to
not.
300 million people in America.
Although I went on a limb and I compared the village of Key Biscayne to the United States of America at the beginning of my talk.
You did.
We got here, must have gotten here late.
By the way, you know what I learned in doing all this reading? The word idiot comes from a Greek word that means roughly self-interested, not interested in others or other things. So let's not be idiots.
Yeah, your opening was really a call to engagement, and I mourn the fact that even in an election that was as talked about as this one was, we still only got half the electorate out to vote.
Yeah.
Slave
Which is
votes
just
were 3/5
utterly insane, and on that count,
Not even that.
I'm discouraged. I'm not optimistic. It seems if we if only half the people come out to vote, and that's on a big election, such a smaller percentage are writing letters to their congressman, showing up at a demonstration, doing whatever, being involved, engaged, and informed.
Yeah, but at the risk of lifting your pessimism, during the healthcare debate, forgetting what you think the right policy is, how many people showed up and weighed in with their opinions during that discussion, town hall meetings and so forth. So
It's encouraging.
I think that it's a problem. Young people talk a lot about Citizens United, the Supreme Court, the big money, dark money in politics, and they feel like it just doesn't pay to care because they're so powerless and the money is so controlling. But you got to convince them that they're wrong about that.
Part of the primary campaign, Bernie Sanders disproved that he could launch a very strong campaign with lots of tiny little contributions.
You're right.
And a lot of times the guy with the most money, not all the time, but sometimes the guy with the most money loses.
Yeah, remember who had the most money at the beginning was Jeb Bush.
Yeah.
That's
Everybody
right.
said it was unbeatable.
That's
Yeah.
right.
And I think that's very positive.
Mm-hmm.
I think the sad thing is that the statistics that the 18 to 25-year-olds, 17% voted.
Yes.
There's something in our education system that probably needs
Mm-hmm.
some fire built under them in terms of citizenship.
It gets to, the point that Greg brought up about how polarized our country is.
Mm-hmm.
If young people or any people think that it doesn't matter because our institutions will just take care of it, that there will be an equivalizing, balancing effect because we're not a hysterical country. I get that, but I don't think that's a safe bet on which to rely.
Yeah.
Plus, it's not a good way to live, in my opinion.
Not only that, but as the situation is now, you've lost some of the checks and balances because one group, one party, luckily they're broken up a little bit with different factions having different opinions. But one party is controlling the three
Yes.
different, so they're not they're not balancing each other.
I hope it
It's a
doesn't.
real problem.
I hope it doesn't happen in the Senate, but it probably will. The Senate, the United States Senate, has always stood for the adults in the room and the dispassionate guys who will just debate, and if they can't get to consensus, they'll just push it till the next time.
Well, they were the big landowners, right? I mean, there's people in the Senate who are supposed to be the big shots.
Yes. Yeah, getting back to whether people without property are even allowed to vote.
And we should wrap it up with our question.
Father Libby.
A slightly different angle. You mentioned at the very beginning, the founding fathers, you mentioned natural law several times. And I can remember watching some Senate hearings on the Supreme Court where natural law was ruled out. The candidate would not base his decisions on natural law. The other thing is you mentioned understanding of human nature, which back at that time was really talking about original sin, to use the theological term. It's not perfect. And again, we have ruled out a religious base for our decisions of what is good and what is not good. I mean, I don't care where you put the Ten Commandments on the village council door, but nonetheless, that's a basic of justice that's been with us for over 3,000 years, and we cannot refer to that.
I don't think it's that cut and dry, actually. I think we can and do, and we do all the time. Maybe this is a case where our self-policing and respect for each other's, kind of private sensibilities causes us to be discreet and deferential, but I don't think we could make the point that religion is shorn and absent in our society.
Good.
As far as jurisprudence goes, it's a long conversation, and maybe we'll have to do that in another topic, but I think you're channeling this jurisprudential notion of originalism in constitutional interpretation. I will confess that I don't understand it jurisprudentially or intellectually, and I think it's a code word for something else actually, but if the notion that you can't refer to Plato derives from the fact that Plato is not in the Constitution, that is correct. But if you take some of what I was trying to communicate tonight and discern that there is something of Plato in the Constitution, and you use that to try to inform what something as vague as due process means or equal protection means, which is not defined, right? You're going to channel Plato, maybe, if you choose to, if you're educated, and if you choose to. I think judges bring to bear their own lives and their own sensibilities in different ways. If you honor originalism as a strict parameter on interpretation, maybe you can't do that, because if it's not written in the Constitution, it's inapplicable.
And I think people forget that the Constitution was a highly contested, fought over. Compromises were made that people hated, and more compromises were made. It was never this beautiful thing that we've put up there and we've agreed to, and the last lecture I went to said the Founding Fathers, the last thing in the world they would have wanted is for somebody to say, look, hey, look, we gotta take it literally 200 years ago, kind of thing. That they recognized it as a flawed document. Nobody got what they wanted, and that, if you look at it today as, this perfection, that's not really reality.
I agree with that. I think
No, I didn't say that.
No, I
Okay.
I know you didn't.
Okay.
the example that is most obvious is the Second Amendment, because the proponents of an unrestricted gun legislation refer textually, line by line, word by word, to what it says, and leave everybody else to conclude that it means something other than that, which arguably it does. But the literal reliance on words on a page is not common, and I think not necessary, certainly not mandated by jurisprudence. But, Supreme Court judges make up jurisprudence, so who am I to say?
Do you know that Thomas Jefferson changed in the final draft the wording that was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, and he changed it to the pursuit of.
Really?
Ah,
Wow.
Really?
That's interesting.
wow.
Yeah, I do know that. See, I had an editor in Prudence, and I felt very comfortable. Jefferson was not that comfortable with his editors, Adams and who else? But it's interesting to see the original Jefferson draft versus the final disseminated document. There's not a lot of changes. Jefferson was a great writer, but there are some. Happiness, by the way, in 17th or 18th century parlance, translates to contentment.
Yes.
I hope you're content with this.
Yes.
Thank you.
You did a great job.
Thank you all.